Hello and welcome to APP 101. This is Anatomy, Physiology, and Pathology. Today we'll be discussing the cells and tissues. We'll be working from your textbook Introduction to Massage Therapy, and we will be based out of Chapter 3 today. First thing in Chapter 3 is make note of the key terms on page 55 and 56. You will be responsible for knowing those. And of course, anything in bold, be sure you're familiar with. A couple of the major terms is essential to know, of course, is going to be anatomy and physiology. So anatomy refers to the structures of the body. It comes from the Greek roots, ana meaning up or again, and tomi meaning cutting or dissection. So the breakdown of the word anatomy is basically cutting up. Physiology refers to the study of the functions of the body. Cells and tissues is the main topics we're going to be talking about today. And we break those down into two different groups. One section will be cells, one section will be tissues. We'll start out with the cell, of course. The cell is the basic building block for structures of living things. And then tissue is defined as organized group or layer of cells that have a similar structure and function. In regard to cells, we have three cellular functions, that is growth, maintenance, and reproduction. The first of those is growth. Growth is done through a process of metabolism, which is the breakdown or buildup of nutrients to generate energy and build molecules. So it breaks down nutrients and builds up molecules. Anabolism is the constructive process that actually builds the molecules, where catabolism is the breakdown process, and during this breakdown it releases energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And ATP is simply a complex molecule that contains adenosine and 3 phosphate molecules. So how exactly does the cell break down and release energy? It is done through a chemical process. ATP is, like I said, is the adenosine bound to 3 phosphates. There's a lot of energy stored in the bond between the second and third phosphate groups that can be used for chemical reactions. When a cell needs energy, it's going to break off that third phosphate, and it creates that kind of a burst of energy as that chemical reaction occurs in the process of it breaking off. Once that third phosphate does break free, the molecule is then called adenosine diphosphate with a D, di for 2, and then there's also a free phosphate molecule just kind of floating around. And it can happen again with the second phosphate. It can actually break it off. Also, it will not release as much energy with that phosphate, but it does still release a little bit of energy. And when that second phosphate is broken off, then it's adenosine monophosphate, or AMP. When the cell has excess energy, it can store the energy by forming ATP from the adenosine diphosphate and the extra phosphate floating around. The second part of cellular function is the maintenance stage, which is also homeostasis. This is this occurs during the adjustment of balancing out the state of equilibrium that's done. And it's done so through a process called a negative feedback system. A negative feedback system is similar to a thermostat in a house. So like you set the temperature to a certain degree. When it gets hotter than that temperature, or it gets hot as that temperature, the air conditioner is going to kick on and cool it back down to that temperature again to keep it steady at that particular setting. That's an example of a negative feedback system. I want each of you to go online and research 3 examples of negative feedback systems and send that to me in an email at the end of the course when you turn in everything else. So you'll need to have your 3 examples of negative feedback systems included in with the rest of your coursework. So we'll pause for a minute and let you look that up. Okay, now that everybody's looked up negative feedback systems, we'll move on to the third function of the cell, which is reproduction. Reproduction of the cell is done through cellular division, and cellular division occurs in 3 stages: mitosis, which is the division of the nucleus; cytokinesis, which is the division of the actual cell itself; and interphase. There's not actually a division going on during interphase. It's kind of just resting and preparing for mitosis. So it's preparing to start the cycle over again. So what happens during mitosis? During mitosis, this is the process of the nucleus actually dividing. There's 4 phases in mitosis, which is the first phase of the cellular division. So the first one is prophase. This is where the chromosomes thicken and resemble limp X's that are identical pairs of chromatids. The nuclear membrane also breaks down and it kind of just disappears. If you see here this little cell, the chromosomes in the middle are kind of thickening out and they're kind of limp looking almost, and actually the doesn't really show a very good picture of it here, but the nuclear membrane is breaking down, and then you can see in metaphase where the nuclear membrane is completely gone. So in metaphase, that's our second stage of mitosis. This is where all those paired up chromatids line up along the middle of the cell. Then the next phase is anaphase. This is where the chromatids separate and they send each of the identical parts to the opposite sides of the cell. So you see where they're all together, they're still in the nuclear membrane here in prophase. In metaphase, the nuclear membrane is completely gone and they've all lined up in the middle. And then anaphase, you've got your half your X here and half your X here, so your chromatids have separated off and went to separate sides of the cell. Then next you have the telophase. This is where the chromosomes lengthen back out and thin out also. The nuclear membrane, the nuclear membrane forms around that those chromosomes again. So you see the nuclear membrane is back, and there's actually 2 of them now because there's 2 nuclei, and that gets the cell ready to go into cytokinesis. So once we go through telophase and we have 2 nuclei, then cytokinesis kicks in, and that's where the cellular membrane starts wrapping around the outside of the nucleus to form 2 separate yet identical cells. They're just simply smaller cells. Once you have 2 identical smaller cells in cytokinesis, you go into the phase of interphase. And interphase is where, again, it's just kind of that resting stage. It's getting ready to prepare to go into the mitosis stage once again. There's three basic components of the cell. There is the cell membrane, there's cytoplasm, and then the cytoplasmic organelles. We'll start with the cell membrane. This is also commonly referred to as the plasma membrane. This is the outer layer of the cell. It protects the cell's contents. It's semi-permeable, which allows nutrients to enter and waste to exit. And this is the entering and exiting of the cell is done through passive transport or active transport. Passive transport is done without energy, so it requires no energy for nutrients and waste to enter or exit, and active transport requires energy for those to enter or exit. Passive transports include diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and filtration, where active transports are exocytosis and endocytosis. First up, we'll be talking about passive transports. I've included a link to a video. You'll be able to access that through your Versal page. I'll let you pause now so that you can go and watch that video and then come back. Okay, great. So now you've watched the video on passive transports. So we'll just go over a couple of the types of passive transports. First up, we had diffusion. This is where the chemical ions and the molecules, I should say move, not more, move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration until they're evenly dispersed. Osmosis is basically the same thing, but it's the process of water moving from higher concentration to lower concentration to balance it out. So if there's more water on the outside of the cell, then more water is going to rush into the cell to balance it. If there's too much water inside and less water outside of the cell, then the water will move from the inside of the cell to outside of the cell to balance itself. Then we had facilitated diffusion. This is where a carrier protein attaches and alters the shape of the larger molecules and then pulls it through the membrane. And then finally we have filtration. This is where water and solutes are pushed through the membrane by fluid pressure, moving them from higher pressure to lower pressure. Next up, we'll talk about active transport. And again, there's another video, and I'll pause here and let you go watch the video and then come back. Okay, so with active transport, we have exocytosis and endocytosis. Exocytosis is where the bulk transport mechanisms that take cellular products from inside the cell to the outside of the cell. So it exits the cell. So exocytosis. Endocytosis is where it brings stuff into the cell. Bulk transport mechanism takes cellular products from outside to inside the cell. This third video here is a video, kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of active and passive transport and kind of a comparison activity. So it's a neat little video, and it kind of helps you to understand a little bit better, to clarify any shortcomings you may have at this point. So I'll let you watch it and then we'll move on. Okay, so the second component of the cell, first component was the cell membrane, and we talked about it being semi-permeable, being the kind of protective layer around the cell, protects the cell, controls what goes in and out, talked about how things go in and out through active and passive transport. So next we have the second component of the cell, which is cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is just that liquid substance that houses the cellular activity. It's what's inside the cell membrane. It's composed of cytosol, which contains nutrients, minerals, enzymes, and cytoplasmic organelles. Which brings us to the third component of the cell, which is actually multiple components, but it's kind of categorized as all organelles. So cytoplasmic organelles is what keeps the cell alive and dynamic. These include the nucleus, the nucleolus, the ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, and centrioles. You find a breakdown of each of these on page 63 in your textbook, but to keep things moving along quickly, I've got a list of each of those here. Make sure you're familiar with every one of these. You probably will see these again. And then here is another picture of the cell. I chose a different picture from the one in the textbook. Not that the one in the textbook is bad by any means. I just feel like this kind of generic picture of the cell gives you a better, clearer view of it. Great, so now we'll move on to tissues. We said earlier, tissues are groups of cells with similar structure that work together to accomplish a similar function. We have a couple of different types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue, we have muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. The epithelial tissue covers the outside of the body, essentially the skin. It lines cavities and tubes, and it forms glands. Connective tissue comes in 4 types. We have hard, which is the cartilage and the bones. Fibrous, which is the tendons, ligaments, and the scar tissue. Soft, which is the areolar and the adipose tissue. And then liquid, which would be considered the blood and the lymph. Technically, the blood and the lymph is not tissues, but because it connects one part of the body to the other, it is considered to be connective tissue. And basically with connective tissue, the main thing you need to know is that basically it serves different functions. It's located throughout the body, and it simply connects one part of the body to another. It provides gentle support structure to the various parts of the body. It also protects internal organs, and it serves as a defensive barrier against disease. Okay, now we're going to go on to muscle tissue. This is on page 70 in your textbook if you're following along in your text through this PowerPoint. We have 3 different types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Muscle tissue itself is a group of muscle cells that are grouped together with blood vessels and packaged with connective tissue in a specific organization, more commonly called a muscle. Talked about the 3 types being skeletal, cardiac, smooth. We're going to break those down a little bit. Skeletal muscle tissue is simply the muscle tissue that attaches to the skeleton. This is the main tissue we'll be working with massage is skeletal muscle tissue and fascia. And we'll talk more about fascia later on. The second type of muscle tissue is the cardiac muscle. And the cardiac muscle tissue is found only in the walls of the heart. It has a couple of different characteristics from the skeletal muscle tissue, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then we have the smooth muscle tissue as our third type of muscle tissue. This is sometimes called visceral muscle. Basically, it's typically in the layers of the stomach, in the intestines. It provides a long, weak contraction compared to the others. So it's allows for digestion, and kind of, as it does the long, slow contractions, it kind of pushes the food through the intestines. Okay, so this picture is on page 71 in your textbook. This kind of breaks down the different characteristics of the muscle tissues. You'll notice on the first one is smooth muscle. You don't see the lines in it, which are considered striations. You do see that they are kind of long, tapered cells. Each one of these is a smooth muscle cell. And inside it, you see the little dot, that is your nucleus. So there's one nucleus. There is the tapered ends, and there's no striations. This muscle works involuntarily, meaning you don't have to think about it. And again, it provides that slow, long, sustained contraction. And the second one listed here is the cardiac muscle tissue. This is the cardiac muscle cells, specifically, that it's showing. And you see it kind of has these branch-looking cells. There's just one nucleus, but it has these little lines in it that are called the striations, so it has light striations. Again, the cardiac muscle is an involuntary muscle designed to pump blood out of the heart, and it's found in the wall of the heart. And then last, we have skeletal muscle tissue. These are long, cylindrical cells. They are multinucleated. This picture doesn't actually show it very well, but there's more than one nucleus in here. The angle from this picture doesn't show more than one in each individual cell. These muscles are voluntary, meaning we have to actually think and produce function for them to work. Their action is to move the skeleton, and they attach to the bones. Now we'll go on. My slide's trying to get ahead of me. Okay, so now we'll go into nervous tissue. This starts on page 72 in your text. So, nervous tissue has specialized structure that serves as the communication path for controlling activity within our bodies. It sends electrochemical impulses to and from different parts of the bodies to receive stimuli and trigger bodily responses. The structural components that make up the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves include two types of nervous tissue cells called neurons and neuroglia. So that's where we pick up with this slide. Our neuron is, simply put, the nerve cell. And this is a picture of it here on the slide. The basic unit of nervous tissue is the nerve cell. And then there's three parts to the nerve cell. There's the axon, which is the long, slender tail. The dendrites, which are like the tree branch-looking parts of the cell. And then the body. And the body is the rounded structure contains the nucleus within it. Up next is neuroglia. This is a type of connective tissue cell. It's still a nervous tissue cell, but it works specifically with the connective tissue. It's designed to support and protect the neurons, which are the nerve cells. One of the ways it protects it is it produces this little substance here called the myelin. All this little red sheath that's around the axon, that is produced by the neuroglia. The neuroglia also connects the neurons to the blood vessels, and they destroy and remove pathogens and help circulate cerebral spinal fluid. Have a video for you to go watch. We'll pause a few minutes for you to watch that and then come back. Okay, next up we talk about tissue membranes. Membranes are thin sheets of tissue with many different characteristics that give rise to different functions. A couple of the different functions: they serve as a covering for the outside of the body. They serve as a covering for the organs. They serve as an anchor for the organs, keeping them in place so your organs aren't just kind of randomly floating around within us. They act as a partition between structures, so they kind of separate our abdominal cavities, or not just our abdominal, but our different bodily cavities. They serve as a lining for tubes of cavities in the body, and they reduce friction between structures. So with this, we have two types of membranes. We have epithelial membrane and we have connective tissue membranes. With the epithelial membranes, there's three types. There's serous membranes, mucous membranes, and cutaneous membranes. The serous membranes lines the ventral body cavities and covers the organs. The mucous membranes protects the exposed spaces to the outside of the body. Protects spaces exposed to the outside of the body. Then you have cutaneous membrane, simply your skin. This protects the body from the environment. Then finally we have connective tissue membranes. There's four different types of connective tissue membranes. There's synovial membranes, meninges, connective tissue sacs, and fascia. With synovial membranes, these membranes line joints of cavities. They form the tendon sheaths and the bursa. They line the joints of the cavities, the tendon sheaths, and the bursa. They don't form them, they line them. The bursa is a small sac kind of within the joint that kind of helps protect the joint itself. And it kind of provides a cushion between the tendon and the bone. The next one, meninges. This is the covering that protects the brain and the spinal cord. Everyone's heard of meningitis, where it affects the brain and the spinal cord and can ultimately lead to death. That's when the meninges gets inflamed. Connective tissue sacs encase the anatomical structures. Examples of these sacs are the pericardium, where it encases the heart, the periosteum, where it encases the bone, and the perichondrium, which encases the cartilage. Went blank for a minute. And then finally we have fascia. The fascia is the meshwork of the body. It provides support and protection for the body's organs, and it is key to massage. Again, most of the time when we're doing massage, we're working with the fascia and the muscles. And that brings us to the end of this section. So I want you to go on, and if you haven't watched all the videos, watch all the videos. If you need to watch the videos again, please do that. There's a quiz on your Versal site. I want you to go to that, take your quiz. You have to have a 73 or above to pass and move on. Once you reach that stage, then you can come back and we will begin the next section, which will be pathology.